All right, class. Well, let's say as we always say, we're back. Of course, we're in the middle of our discussion on the philosophy of religion. Now, by way of review, we've talked about what is the philosophy of religion, what is the nature of faith and reason, and we've gone on to talk about agnosticism, right, or theological agnosticism. Also a bit of intellectual agnosticism, but specifically, and for our concern here, theological agnosticism. And then we've talked about religious language, right? How do we talk about God and whatnot? So with that said, we can actually begin to move into our philosophical arguments. So let's scroll through all of what we've gone through, all of this ground that we've covered here. The topics that we've literally just mentioned: agnosticism, skepticism, religious language, faith and reason, and so on. And so now what we're going to come to today within the philosophy of religion is what most people usually want to associate with philosophy of religion. And that is, here we go, philosophical arguments. For and against the existence of God. Now, this is going to be more so an introduction into the types of arguments that we're going to discuss today. Of course, you're viewing this as a lecture series, so you may be able to go immediately right into the argument after this presentation if you'd like to do so. But of course, you may marinate on these concepts and these just this template, so to speak, before you actually go into greater depth into any of the initial arguments themselves. Now, when we talk about arguments, we're going to do this in a different way than might normally be done in say this type of format. So what I want to do, and we're going to start to look at our outline here on this slide. What I want us to look at, what I want us to concentrate on, are going to be classical philosophical arguments within the history of the philosophy of religion. Now, what do I mean by that, right? Well, a lot of what I mean by that is going to be dependent upon kind of your background. So if you're heavily into apologetics and Christian evidences and that sort of thing, well, then this may be familiar territory, but, and this is important, it's not going to be identical territory. As you see in the slide, I'm going to leave off more of the popular, even though I say here those substantial arguments that are usually part of an apologetics type course. So something like the Kalam cosmological argument, though this is a philosophy of religion class, more than likely I'm not going to get into that version of a cosmological argument, or even other types of arguments like the moral argument, right, for the existence of God, or the axiological argument. I want us to look at historically, almost in some sense, even some that are ancient arguments, philosophical, purely philosophical arguments for the existence of God. And these are not going to be confined to specifically or only Christian Christian thinkers, right, and arguments for theism. We're going to look at arguments that, of course, there will be some Christian thinkers here, some Christian philosophers here, but there will also be non-Christian arguments that will be looked at. So, for example, we have Aristotle, we have Plotinus, we have St. Augustine, we have St. Aquinas, and others. Leibniz, he'll probably be the newer of any of those that we actually discuss here, will be Leibniz. Now, you may be asking, well, why are we doing this, right? Why are we not just getting into the classical types of apologetics arguments, or the traditional or the popular apologetics arguments? Well, again, because I want to try to leave that off for if you're already familiar with that, or if you're already taking an apologetics type course, somewhere. or here possibly. I want to leave that endeavor to those types of courses. Now, that's not to say, this is an important remark here, that's not to say that these arguments aren't also substantial and or strong. In fact, I would say, and this may be just my bias as someone that's interested specifically in philosophy for philosophy's sake in some sense, is I think that these arguments, if not just as interesting, it's possible that they could be even more interesting, or even I would even argue more substantial in some sense. Again, and I'm not trying to downplay the more popular apologetic type arguments that you're familiar with, or that you may be familiar with, but just to introduce you to some classic roots, so to speak, of the philosophy of religion. Now, I wanted to go ahead and point out too on this slide that you'll notice that, again, the non-Christian as well as Christian thinkers are going to argue for the existence of God. Now, that's important in and of itself because usually it's stated, or it's not uncommon to be stated, let me say it that way, that only, or it's kind of assumed that only the Christians argue for the existence of God, and if that argument runs, well then, you still have Zeus, you still have, any of this pantheon of Greek gods or Norse mythology, Thor, Odin, all of these types of things. But what I want you to notice is that these arguments are going to disallow you to say, well, any of these arguments, what's so great about these arguments? If these arguments work, well, you still don't know if it's Odin or Thor. Well, no. If any of these arguments work, even these, again, this is important, then even the non-Christian types of arguments, these types of arguments disallow for these highly anthropomorphic conceptions conceptions of God, like Zeus or Odin or Thor or whoever else, Aztec types of gods, right? Any sort of Roman mythology, all of those sorts of things are just by definition ruled out if these arguments run. Well, how do we know that? Well, because if the arguments run, well, they're going to get into the nature of this type of God, right? This is why classical philosophy and classical theists would say, even though Plotinus, right, is not a Christian, even though Aristotle is not a Christian theist, that they're arguing in some sense, not completely, but in some sense, they're really arguing or using reason to get back to the existence of God. And if God does exist, then it has to be this type of God. And ironically, paradoxically, coincidentally, however you want to word that there, this God that they're arguing towards, at base, is going to be something very, very similar to the traditional Judeo-Christian, even to some extent the Islamic conception of what God must be, that there must be this sort of God, and we can reach thus far using reason, logic, intellect, rationality, that sort of thing. Of course, empirical observation is going to be most of these types of arguments here, right? The only one that may not be necessarily empirical in some sense would be the rationalist type arguments that we'll give by Leibniz, right? We'll go into that in a little more detail. Now, that would conclude, or that would lead us up to this last concluding thought here, is that a lot of these arguments, or all of these arguments, I should say, none of which are new, but many of which, if not all, will be new to many people, right? So they're not new, but they may be new to you, right? Even though these are classic, even though these are ancient, old school types of arguments, right? Now, you notice here too that I have a doctor of philosophy, Ed Fazer, who is out of California, we're going to be following his lead. He's revamped, dusted off a lot of these arguments. I mean, he's not the only one to have done so, but he does it in a very friendly fashion, in a way that helps to make those that aren't necessarily majoring in philosophy, or even those that are majoring in philosophy, to understand them, right? He just does this in a very, very efficient way. Very, very good with words, easy with words. So we're going to follow his lead here in looking at these arguments as he formulates them throughout our presentation. So let's continue. Now, just this, okay. So let us go ahead and look at some of the arguments that we plan to peruse as we go through the course here, as we go through this section in the philosophy of religion course in our arguments. As I stated, they're going to be classical. They're going to be philosophical, right? We're not going to use any sort of scientific argument. And when I say scientific, I mean in the sense that most people understand when they employ the term. Things like modern day types of ID arguments or intelligent design type arguments. We're not going to look at those types of arguments. These arguments, again, we're going to see that one of the strengths of these types of philosophical arguments is that they're able to last throughout time, whether it be backwards in time or whether it be forwards in time. Because again, if you've got a philosophical argument that's an in principle type argument, and it's not necessarily completely or doesn't rely solely on inductive, like the inductive method, like something like a modern ID type argument, a modern intelligent design type argument, that these arguments, it's irrelevant what year or what type of scientific inquiry may come about, what type of scientific knowledge or understanding may come about, that if these arguments work, that in principle they work no matter what the science may or may not say. And I think that's the strength of these types of arguments, is that you don't have to necessarily worry over the changing nature of scientific data, right, or scientific knowledge in the sense of what we would normally mean by the term science, right? They're in principle type arguments. Now, the first that we're going to look at is an Aristotelian type of cosmological argument. Now, again, following Feser's lead here, he wants to make clear that this is not Aristotle's argument as he may give it, but it's an argument as if Aristotle may give it in our day and age, right? With updated examples, with information that may be pertinent to our experience as 21st century people here. Now, what this argument is going to push towards is it's going, and again, I'm trying to give you the overview of each of these arguments before we get into them, so you at least have some sort of backdrop. Now, what this kind of argument is going to contain is it's going to have a lot of metaphysics here. There's going to be some unpacking of metaphysical claims, some metaphysical conceptions that we're going to have to talk about as we discuss this argument. So this one is primarily going to be the unmoved mover type of argument. It's going to, and what it means by that, it doesn't mean moved as in, I'm just simply moving the pen around right now, or this phone is being moved around. When it talks about moved or unmoved mover, it's talking about change, right? The fact that we witness change, that some things change from one state of affairs to another. So, for instance, the leaves out here on the trees are blowing, right? They went from a state of not blowing in the breeze to blowing in the breeze, right? There's a change there, a change in this sense, a change of location, right? Literally from here to here, from here to here. Some things go from hot to cold, right? Some things go from cold to hot, right? That there's this change involved. Now, the Aristotelian terms, the metaphysical terms there would be something like act, right? Or actuality, and potency, right? Or potentiality. And Aristotle is going to argue that all things exist, or almost all things, that's an important qualification in the argument we're going to look at, is that things exist as combinations of act and potential. So for instance, right now, I exist actually, right? I actually exist, but I have the potential to not exist. And at one point, I had the potential to exist in some sense, right? Or even with my hair, right? I have the potential to grow my hair long again or whatever, and I have the potential to cut it a bit shorter, right? Shave it, right? So things change. They go from one state of affairs to a different state of affairs. And Aristotle is going to argue in this unmoved mover type of argument. Of course, he has more arguments, but this one specifically, he's going to argue that there has to be an unmoved mover or a purely actualized actualizer, right? There's going to have to be something that's not going from states of affairs. Otherwise, nothing is going to be able to account for why we do see things go from particular states of affairs to another state of affairs. That may sound like a whole lot of what at this point. Don't worry. We're going over this here. And again, recall the arguments that will be perused will be philosophical, and that is timeless, right? They're not going to be contingent upon the latest scientific discovery or whatever, and they need not be dependent on scientific inquiry in the sense that most understand the term. Again, what we just mentioned. All right. So what would our next argument be that we look at? We're going to look at a Neoplatonic version of a cosmological argument. Now, this argument that we're going to look at is going to be from another, what we would call pagan, right, philosopher. Now, dismiss any notion of what you would normally think of by pagan, right? We don't mean pagan as in some wild party animal. We mean pagan in the sense that a pagan was someone that didn't hold classically to one of the traditional monotheistic faiths like Judaism, Christianity, or Islam, right? So this argument would be from the early Greek philosopher, around the 300s or so, 2 to 300 AD era, right, of Plotinus, right? And what this type of argument is going to argue is that there is some sense in which things are unified, right? So you see, let's just say, for example, a tricycle, right? That there's these constituent parts of a tricycle, right? You've got the wheel in the front, you've got a wheel in the back, another wheel in the back, you've got a seat rest, right? You've got the handlebars. But these things, even though they're particular parts, there has to be something that unifies them, right? There has to be this unifying concept around tricycle itself, right? Or even a better example would be something like a tree, right? You have a tree trunk, you have the bark, you have the leaves, you have the branches, you have the limbs, whatever. So you have all of these constituent parts of a tree, but there has to be something that unifies the whole of the tree, right? The universal, right? And universal, I mean in the philosophical sense of like universals in nature's essences, those types of things. And what that's going to do is to say that if things are composite, right, and they're made up of parts, that, like, as Phaser is going to argue this way, he's going to say that the ultimate cause of such things can only be something which is absolutely simple or non-composite, right? And Plotinus is going to call this the one, right? This is kind of his reference to God, right? The one. Meaning that not everything can be made up of only constituent parts, right? Or composite parts, right? This is also going to touch on one of what has become to be controversial claims of the divine simplicity, right, of God, right? And we'll get into that when we look at that argument. But roughly speaking, this is going to say that, the things of our experience in various ways are made up of composite parts, right? And there has to be something that unifies these, right? It can't continually go back to an infinite regress of just composite parts. There's going to have to be some ultimate unifier, right? As Plotinus would call the one. Now, and again, here's our reminder, right? Recall the arguments that will be perused will be philosophical. None of these will be susceptible to the latest scientific advancement, right? The next argument that we would look at here would be an Augustinian version of a cosmological type of argument. Now, I'm going to go ahead and tell you this. I like all of these arguments, but this particular argument, it's going to be one of the more difficult arguments, I think, to explain. But at the same time, it might be my favorite argument. It's very, very abstract. It's going to argue for the reality of nature's essences, what we call in philosophy universals, right? That universals really do exist, right? That these are these things that exist that aren't material. And it's going to argue, Augustine, right, is going to argue that because of these universals, all of these these natures and essences, things like redness, humanness, triangularity, he's going to argue that the ultimate ground of these types of things is not going to be in, say, Plato's idea of the world of the forms and whatnot. And it's not going to, you're not going to be able to ground these types of things, strictly speaking, in particular instances of things, right? Like you can't ground humanness just in, me as a human, right? And a couple other humans or however many we have. He's going to argue that the only way that we can truly ground these types of things is in the mind, right? But then he's going to say, I don't want to give away the argument, but he's going to try to get, so let me just say it this way. He's going to try to say the ultimate way to ground this is going to be in the divine mind, right? I think this is going to be a very interesting, or not it's going to be, it is a very interesting type of argument that I hope that you enjoy as well. So the next argument would be a Thomistic version, right? And some Thomists would say Thomism being a school of philosophy, right? Within just philosophy in general, right? Not a rationalist, not a continental, that's not even a word, right? Not a continental type philosopher, but a Thomist, right? Just another school of thought here. Now, some would say this is the quintessential Thomistic argument, right, for the existence of God. So what it's going to do, it's going to begin, again, as Phaser notes, that it's going to argue that for any of the contingent things of our experience, there's a real distinction between its essence, right, its nature or its essence. So, for instance, my nature is human, right? I have a human nature. And he's going to say that there's a difference between my nature being human and my existence, right, that I am, right, that I am a human. So the essence is what a thing is, right? And the existence is that it is, right? That it does, in fact, exist. He's going to argue that there's going to be a difference between the nature of a thing and the thing's existence itself. However, it's going to say that this thing couldn't exist, right, unless something is giving it existence, unless something is providing its existence, meaning that just because you are human, that doesn't mean that you can account for why you even exist at all, right? You can account for your existence. There has to be something that, because existence is not part of your essence as a human, there has to be something that's giving you existence, right? That you're getting existence, not you got existence, but you're getting it right now, literally. The very second that you're watching this particular lecture, that you're getting existence. So Aquinas is going to argue there has to be, again, some sort of uncaused causer, right, of this getting of existence, right? And this thing, whatever it is, it's going to have to, there can't be any difference between, there can be no distinction between the fact that it does exist and the fact of existence itself, that it is existence. So as the argument would go, or as the argument we'll see how it pans out, that its essence is existence, right? Again, in contrast to your essence is not existence, you are one thing, a human being, and you have existence, right? But this thing, this argument will go, is that this thing's essence just is to exist, right? Of course, this would be God, right? This uncaused God. And we'll look at that. Now, this last argument, well, I shouldn't say last, we may look at a few others, but the last in this series of classical arguments is going to be a rationalist type version of the existence of God. And it's really going to hang on and depend on the defense of, say, the principle of sufficient reason, right? And this is going to be something like a Leibnizian, right, or Leibniz's argument here. And what that's going to say is, I'm just going to read this off to you from Phaser. Check this out. The proof begins with a defense of the principle of sufficient reason, or PSR, according to which everything is intelligible or has an explanation for why it exists and has the attributes it has. It then argues that there cannot be an explanation of the existence of any of the contingent things of our experience unless there is a necessary being, the existence of which is explained by its own nature. So this is, I don't want to say that it's completely an a priori type argument, even though it's a rationalist argument in some sense, because Phaser is going to come from the angle of, he's going to have his Thomistic influence in when he's talking about these types of arguments. So it's not going to be, strictly speaking, an a priori type of argument. Well, we'll see when we get there. Just so you know that, right? Just keep that in mind as we approach these types of things, as we get on down the road and looking at these arguments. Now, before I go into this next slide here, well, I'll go ahead and say that. Usually one of the topics that we discuss within the philosophy of religion is the nature of God, right? So usually you go through arguments for God's existence, you go through the nature of God, all these sorts of types of things. But one of the cool things about these classical types of arguments is that they will, just by default, just the way in which they run, they will by themselves start to get to the nature of God. Meaning that if the argument runs, right, and specifically if all of these arguments work, if they all run, well then if they run, well, you're just going to be able to draw the attributes of what God must be like in virtue of the truth of the argument, right? In virtue of the truth of the conclusion of the argument, that if God exists, well, it would have to be this type of God. That if this argument works, and if God exists, well, then this would just have to be the way in which this God is, the nature of God, the attributes of God. So we're not going to look at this. We're not going to look at this topic or this genre of philosophy of religion separately from the arguments, because again, if the arguments work, then they're going to speak directly to what type of God, what the nature of God would have to be if the argument itself runs. Now, before I go to this next slide, let me get a little peek right here. Yeah, okay. Let me go ahead and go back. So let's just camp out here. I think what I want to do, I think this will be very helpful. I want to go ahead and just go back to, I want to flip back up to these arguments as we presented them, or as we started to highlight these arguments, these 5 arguments. By the way, don't confuse this with the 5 ways of Aquinas. Some of Thomas Aquinas' arguments will be included here, but this isn't the 5 ways. We're just looking at 5 proofs here. Now, what I want to do is I want to go ahead and just read you just a quick snippet from, in Feser's words, about, say, this Aristotelian version, and then, say, the Platonic version or Neoplatonic version, then the Augustinian version, the Atomistic, and then the Rationalist version. I just want to do a quick snippet of each of those in Feser's own words. I think this will just kind of help it sink into you. So what we're going to do is we're going to begin with an Aristotelian proof, right? So Feser says, it begins with the fact that there's a real change, this argument, right? The argument begins with the fact that there is a real change in the world. It analyzes change as the actualization of potential and argues that no potential could be actualized at all unless there is something which can actualize without itself being actualized. A, quote, purely actualizer, or an unmoved mover, right, in Aristotelian terms there. And that's how Aristotle characterized God. Now, Aristotle developed an argument of this sort in Book 8 of his Physics and Book 12 of his Metaphysics. Later, Aristotelians such as Maimonides, he was a Jewish thinker there, and Aquinas, the Christian, developed, right, an argument of this sort. It developed their own versions of this type of argument. The first of Aquinas' 5 ways being one statement of this type of argument, right? Now, these earlier writers expressed the argument in terms of archaic scientific notions, such as the movement of the heavenly spheres, but as modern Aristotelians have shown, the essential kernel of the argument in no way depends on those outdated, right, examples. Or in Feser's metaphor here, the essential kernel of the argument in no way depends on this outdated husk, is the way he says that. So again, he's updating it as if they were writing this argument today. All right, so the Neoplatonic proof here. In Feser's words, it says it begins with the fact that the things of our experience are in various ways composite or made up of parts, and argues that the ultimate cause of such things can only be something which is absolutely simple or non-composite, what Plotinus called the One. The core idea of such an argument can be found in Plotinus's Enneads, and Aquinas gave expression to it as well in some sense. Indeed, the notion of divine simplicity is absolutely central to the classical theist conception of God, though strangely neglected by contemporary writers on natural theology, theists no less than atheists. So Phaser just wants to try to help restore that to what he believes its proper place there. Now, the Augustinian proof of God's the Augustinian proof of God's existence. In Phaser's words, here we go. It says, it begins by arguing that universals, redness, humanness, triangularity, etc., propositions, possibilities, and other abstract objects are in some sense real, but again rejects Plato's conception of such objects as existing in a third realm, distinct from any mind and distinct from the world of particular things. The only possible ultimate ground of these objects, the argument concludes, is a divine intellect, the mind of God. This idea, too, has its roots in Neoplatonic thought and was central to St. Augustine's understanding of God and was defended by Leibniz as well. This book puts forward a more detailed and systematic statement of the argument, as far as I know, has been attempted before. So apparently we're going to try to look at a more robust version of that, right? Now, again, don't be concerned with your text, right? Your text that we're reading for the course are going to be different from this. I'm giving this as a supplement in addition to your text. Now, the Thomistic proof of God's existence, get our slide up here, okay? It begins by arguing that for any of the contingent things of our experience, there's a real distinction between its essence, what the thing is, and its existence, the fact that it is. It then argues that nothing in which there is such a real distinction could exist, even for an instant, unless caused to exist by something in which there is no such distinction. Something, the very essence of which just is existence, and which can therefore impart existence without having to receive it, an uncaused cause of the existence of things. Aquinas presented an argument of this sort in his little book, On Being and Essence, and many Thomists have regarded it as the paradigmatically Thomistic argument for God's existence. Now, the rational proof of the existence of God, this proof begins with the principle of sufficient reason. That'll be defended, right? And according to which everything is intelligible or has an explanation for why it exists and why it has the attributes it has. It then argues that there cannot be an explanation of the existence of any of the contingent things of our experience unless there is a necessary being, the existence of which is explained by its own nature. This argument is famously defended or associated with Leibniz. But again, Phaser goes on to say that he's going to try to he'll come at that in some way from his Aristotelian Thomistic angle there. Now, having said that, let's go ahead and look at, again, these arguments will touch the nature of God, but let's go ahead and move forward in our slides after giving you Phaser's own words there. Now, it's possible, I want to go ahead and say, that it may be, we actually may, depending on the time, right, that we work through these, if I end up eating a lot of time with each particular argument, we may not do this. But if I keep the time relatively short, then we may go ahead and look at some other classical types of arguments for the existence of God. So for instance, R.C. Sproul gives a contingency type argument that's a classical Aristotelian and Thomistic type of argument that I think is very interesting. We may look at that too. However, we'll also look at a few arguments against the theistic position that are usually popular within the philosophy of religion, right? So some of these that we may look at, and this may change throughout the nature of the course, depending again on time, depending on just the flow of what's going on in our course. We'll probably look at incoherence arguments, right? And I know that you're going to be, some of this will be familiar to you because of basic apologetic interests and whatnot. But incoherence arguments are the type of arguments that don't just argue or don't try to argue that God probably doesn't exist, or that it's in the best interest of someone to not believe in the existence of God. These types of arguments will try to go after the very conception of God. meaning that if they work, that God by definition cannot exist because it would be incoherent. It would be like saying something like a married bachelor or a square circle or a one-ended stick, things of that nature that are just logically incoherent. This POE here, this would obviously be one of the most famous examples of an incoherent argument, and that would be the logical problem of evil. Of course, you're already familiar with that, I'm sure, but the logical problem of evil would just try to argue from the fact that evil exists and from the claim that God is both omnipotent and omnibenevolent, or all-powerful and all-good, that it can't possibly be the fact that such a God exists, because as the argument will try to pull out, that those concepts are logically contradictory. You can't have those types of concepts coexisting at the same time, right? So something has to go. Either evil has to go, omnipotence has to go, omnibenevolence has to go, or just the whole conception of God has to go, but they can't all coexist at the same time. Now, some of these other omnipotent type paradoxes, this is distinct from the problem of evil, would be some of your arguments like, can God create a stone so heavy that he himself cannot lift the stone, right? Because, of course, the claim is supposed to be that if he's all powerful, right? Again, it's usually pitting the attributes of God one against the other. So if God is all powerful, then he can create a stone again that he himself cannot lift. However, if he can create a stone which he cannot lift, well, then there's something that God cannot do, which means he can't possibly be all powerful, right? So we'll look at something like that. Now, after those, we're going to look at what I would consider to be one of the more interesting, and I would say, and I use this term analogously here, one of my favorite arguments for atheism. That would be these falsification arguments offered up by very famous atheistic, he was an atheist philosopher of religion. He since converted to some sort of theism, but offered up by the ex-atheist philosopher of religion, Antony Flew. And the falsification arguments, you may have heard of these. One of the examples is going to be, you've got explorers in the jungle that come upon a garden. Another example is going to be, what does it mean to say something like God loves you and has a plan for your life? And what Flew is going to be concerned here is, again, falsification. How do we show that your view is false, or how do we show that your view is meaningful in light of how we would normally talk about, how we would normally discuss things that we know to be true in life other than, say, the existence of God? All of that will become much more clear as we move through these arguments, whether they be for the existence of God, whether they be against the existence of God. But what I wanted to do at the onset was go ahead and give just a basic overview of the types of arguments that we'll look at, these classical arguments for the existence of God, and then touch on a couple of the possible atheistic versions of arguments against God's existence that we'll look at. So that concludes our first lecture on this subtopic within the philosophy of religion of the philosophical arguments themselves. What are we going to look at, right? What type of arguments we're going to look at, try to gauge the flow of the course, and what arguments we're going to look at that don't, say, speak to the existence of God. So, see you next time.